In December 2025, on the outskirts of Colorado Springs, the wind had a voice that no one could ignore. It wasn't the gentle winter gust that rattled windows or carried the smell of pine. It was a 100-mph wall of air, a force that roared across the plains like a freight train with no brakes. And on that night, inside an aging mobile home sitting on soft, rain-soaked ground, 68-year-old Walter Briggs realized the storm was no longer something happening outside. It was coming for him. Walter had lived through blizzards, wildfires, power outages, and the lonely kind of nights only the Colorado high country can create. But nothing prepared him for the moment the first blast hit the trailer so violently that the floor shifted beneath his feet. His old shepherd mix, Duke, started barking before Walter could even steady his breath. By the time he reached the door, the trailer jolted again, harder, as if something massive had slammed into it. Outside, he could hear wood splintering, a falling tree maybe, or several. Then came the moment that changed everything. A final monstrous gust struck from the west, lifting the mobile home just enough to tear one side off its foundation. Walter fell, the world tilting, plates crashing, Duke skidding across the floor. And then the entire structure rolled, grinding against the earth until it landed on its side, pointed straight toward a flooded ditch that was already swallowing the dark. Walter tried to stand, but pain screamed up his leg. He was pinned, and as the wind howled through the broken frame, Duke growled at something moving outside, something watching them through the storm. Before we continue, write down in the comments, from which city are you watching this story, and what time is it there right now? Walter Briggs never imagined that the quiet life he built outside Colorado Springs could turn into a fight for survival in a matter of minutes. At 68, he had grown used to solitude, to the sound of Duke's paws on the floor, and to the rhythm of days shaped by routine rather than urgency. The wind, however, had other plans that night, plans no forecast fully captured. Inside the overturned trailer, the world felt distorted. The ceiling had become a wall, the windows were shattered, and the frame groaned with every new blast of wind. Walter could feel the cold seeping through the cracks as rainwater dripped steadily across the tilted floor. Somewhere beneath the chaos, Duke kept pacing, popping his claws nervously on the metal siding as he sniffed at the dark. Walter knew enough about Colorado storms to understand that the danger didn't vanish after the first impact. Windstorms like this one, the kind that slammed the region with more than 100-mph bursts for hours, brought a second wave of threats: falling trees, live power lines, flash flooding. And the ditch just beyond his trailer was no longer a harmless depression in the ground. It was filling fast. A sharp throb pulsed through his left leg, pinned under a collapsed cabinet. He tried to shift, but the pain shot upward with enough force to blur his vision. He wasn't getting out on his own, not with the wind still tearing across the plains, not with the ground saturated and sliding. He took a slow breath, steadying himself. Duke stopped moving and stared toward the open side of the trailer, ears raised. Something was out there. Not the wind, not the storm. A presence. A shape. Walter listened, and the hairs on his arms rose. Whatever waited outside had begun to move closer. The wind did not settle after the trailer fell. If anything, it grew more confident, pushing against the overturned walls as if it knew the structure was weak and wanted to test how much more it could take. Walter Briggs lay half-twisted on the tilted floor, the metal siding groaning above him, the smell of wet soil, broken insulation, and rain-soaked dust filling the air. Every breath tasted cold and sharp. He reached down to feel his trapped leg again. His jeans were torn, caught under the collapsed cabinet that had broken loose during the roll. Wood pressed against his shin, heavy but not enough to crush bone. He could move his toes, barely, but the pain that followed every attempt to shift told him that forcing it would only make things worse. At his age, even a small fracture was dangerous. He didn't need a mirror to know his face had gone pale. Duke, the old shepherd mix who had been his companion for more than a decade, moved nervously around him. Each gust from outside made the floor tremble and Duke's body stiffen. The dog's low growl vibrated through the metal frame before Walter could even hear what had triggered it. "Easy, boy," Walter muttered, though his voice trembled. "We're still here, still breathing." But even as he said the words, he wasn't sure if they were meant for Duke or for himself. The wind slammed again, harder, and the trailer shifted. Only a few inches, but enough for Walter to feel it drag across the soaked earth. The angle changed. Only slightly, but in a way that made his stomach hollow out. It was sliding toward the ditch. Earlier that afternoon, before the storm hit, that ditch had been nothing more than a shallow depression that ran along the property like a forgotten scar. It filled during heavy rain, then emptied slowly into a stream farther downhill. But now, under the full force of the windstorm, it had transformed into a dark, moving pool of water that reflected nothing but the black night. Walter could hear it now, the wet, rhythmic slosh of rising water pressing against mud. He tried again to pull his leg free. The cabinet didn't budge. He pressed with both arms, grunting, ignoring the way his shoulders throbbed. The metal edge scraped his forearm, and he hissed in pain, but the cabinet refused to move even an inch. He tilted his head back and stared at the ceiling, which was now a sideways wall. The storm outside howled, its voice deep and unrestrained. A sound like distant thunder rolled across the plains, followed by a faint crack. Maybe another tree falling. He'd lived here long enough to know how these storms behaved. They ripped the landscape apart in layers. First the small things, loose debris, old shingles, branches, then the structures that weren't reinforced, and finally the trees that had stood for decades. Another shift, this time sharper, more jarring, made the entire trailer jerk downward, closer to the ditch. Duke barked wildly, losing footing on the tilted floor. He scrambled up the incline, claws scratching, until he stood beside Walter's chest. The dog's body shivered, not from cold, but from something else. Alertness, fear, instinct. Walter lifted a hand and rested it against Duke's neck. "It's all right, buddy. I'm here." But Duke didn't look at him. He stared at the broken frame near the open side of the trailer where the door had once hung. The wind poured through the opening like a living thing, carrying rain and dirt, and a sound Walter couldn't identify at first. A low, steady, rhythmic scrape. Not wind, not debris, something moving outside. Walter held his breath, the pain in his leg momentarily forgotten. He listened. The scrape came again, this time accompanied by a soft thud against the metal siding. Duke growled, the sound deep and warning, the kind of growl he only used when a predator was near. Walter's mind flashed through possibilities. A stray dog? Unlikely. Most strays avoided storms like this. Coyotes? Possible. They roamed freely in the rural edges of Colorado Springs. But Duke had faced coyotes before, and his barks had always sent them running. Another sound, a heavier breath, slow and controlled, drifted through the opening. Walter's stomach tightened. That wasn't a coyote. A coyote moved light, quick, skittish. Whatever was outside was heavier, calmer, and unafraid of the shifting metal and roaring wind. Duke stepped forward, positioning himself between Walter and the open side. The dog's hackles rose, and he let out a single sharp bark. The answer came a moment later, a hard scrape, claws against metal, then a low guttural sound, almost a rumble, followed by a second impact to the side of the trailer. Walter exhaled slowly through clenched teeth. A mountain lion. In these storms, with deer driven into shelter and small prey scattered or buried under debris, mountain lions sometimes followed the edges of settlements. They were territorial, opportunistic and confident. And an overturned trailer, half broken open, with movement and the faint smell of blood drifting out. That would be enough to draw one closer. "Duke," Walter whispered, "stay close." Duke barked again, louder this time, his front paws planted firmly as he faced the darkness. Walter could barely see anything beyond the opening, just flashes of trees bending under the wind, the wet glint of mud, and the pitch-black outlines of the plains. The mountain lion moved again. Walter heard it circling, stepping over debris, brushing against branches swept by the storm. Every few seconds it stopped, listening. The wind drowned out most sounds, but Walter could hear the rhythm of its paws through the vibrations in the metal frame. Not charging, not attacking, studying. waiting. The trailer slid another inch toward the ditch, and water splashed up the side. Walter's heart pounded. If the structure dropped fully into the ditch, the water would rise fast, too fast for a man pinned in place, and if the puma was still nearby. Duke barked again, lunging forward as if trying to leap through the opening. Walter grabbed the dog's collar with both shaking hands and pulled back. "Easy, Duke, easy!" The storm replied with another violent gust, shaking the trailer so hard that dust and insulation rained down from the fractured beams. Walter squeezed his eyes shut. His breath fogged the cold air. He had to think. He needed a plan. The puma would not leave so easily, not while the structure was moving, not while there was the scent of vulnerability in the air. And the ditch. The ditch was becoming louder. The splashing was rhythmic now, like hands slapping water. It was rising. Walter leaned forward and tested the cabinet one more time. No movement. The pain surged again, pulsing in waves. He clenched his jaw, breathing through it, trying to steady his thoughts. The storm was tearing at the world outside. The puma was circling closer. And Duke, loyal but aging, couldn't fight forever. Walter looked toward the open side of the trailer, toward the storm, the darkness, and the shifting silhouette just beyond the edge of the broken frame. He whispered, not sure if the words were prayer or promise. "We're not done yet." The storm outside did not ease. It clawed at the overturned trailer with the persistence of something alive, blowing sheets of icy rain through the broken frame. Walter Briggs felt each gust through the metal floor as a shiver that ran straight into his bones. He tried to ignore the pain burning in his leg, tried to focus on Duke's steady breathing beside him. The dog kept glancing toward the open side of the trailer, ears stiff, body tense, every muscle signaling the same truth. The mountain lion hadn't gone anywhere. Walter shifted again, testing the limits of his trapped leg. Even the smallest movement made his breath catch in his throat. He had survived storms before, but never one that tore apart the world with this kind of force. Never one that flipped his home like a discarded toy. Never one where he lay helpless with a predator, pacing only feet away. The trailer lurched again, a sudden drag downward as mud beneath it gave way. Water splashed against the metal, louder than before. A reminder that the flooded ditch was no longer a threat waiting in the distance. It was already here, already rising. The ditch ran deeper near the back of the property, sloping downward before feeding into a narrow stream. Walter had walked that path hundreds of times. If the trailer slid only a couple more feet, it wouldn't land gently. It would drop straight into the darkest part of that channel, and he wouldn't have the ability to swim. Not with his leg pinned and the structure trapping him inside. Duke barked, jolting him from his thoughts. The sound came again, claws scraping metal, deliberate and steady. The puma was probing the trailer's weak points. Walter could picture it easily. The big cat moving low, shoulders rolling, tail flicking, as it tested the noise and movement. This wasn't panic. This was patience. "Duke, stay close," Walter whispered, though he wasn't sure his voice carried over the wind. The dog's body trembled, but he didn't back away. Loyalty and fear lived together in Duke's eyes, neither winning, neither surrendering. Walter needed a way out, not just for himself, but for Duke. The thought of the dog wrestling with the puma made something cold and fierce coil in his chest. Duke was brave, but age had slowed him. His joints weren't the same. His jumps weren't as high. His breath grew heavy after only a few minutes of exertion. Outside, something thumped against the frame again. Not the puma this time, something heavier rolling in the wind. A trash bin, a torn-off gutter, or maybe debris from the shed that once stood only a few yards away. The sound drew his attention, and for a moment he almost welcomed the distraction. Anything was better than listening to the steady, stalking rhythm of the predator. But then he heard it. A low growl, so subtle he might have missed it, if not for Duke's instant reaction. The dog bristled, ears flattening, and stepped closer to Walter as if preparing to shield him with his own small but determined body. The mountain lion was near the opening. Walter slowly turned his head toward the broken frame. Through the slanted angle of the overturned trailer, he could see only rain, darkness, and the pale blur of wind-driven debris. Then he caught it, a shape, still and careful, crouching at the edge of the floodwater. The lion's head was lowered, eyes fixed on the movement inside the trailer. Even from this distance, Walter saw the faint gleam of amber, reflecting the flickers of distant lightning. "Not tonight," Walter whispered, more to himself than to the animal. "Not like this." The puma's tail swayed, slow and rhythmic. It stepped closer, placing each paw deliberately, as though reading the storm, listening for weakness. Duke snarled, a raw, desperate sound, and lunged forward despite Walter's hand gripping his collar. "Duke, no!" The dog barked again, louder this time, and the puma froze. For a moment neither moved. The wind roared between them, bending trees sideways and sending branches skittering like broken bones across the mud. The puma shifted back a few inches, reassessing. Duke growled until his throat rattled. Then the lion retreated a few steps, but not far. Walter could hear it circling again, choosing a better angle. He felt a surge of warmth in his chest, pride mingled with fear. Duke had bought them time, but time was its own danger. The storm wasn't letting up, the ditch was rising. The trailer was sliding, unstable on the saturated ground. Walter scanned the interior of the overturned home, eyes adjusting to the dimness. The desk lamp lay shattered. The small dining table was snapped in two. A metal toolbox had rolled to the far end, denting the wall. And near it, there it was, the long wooden broom he used for sweeping leaves off the porch. If he could reach it, maybe he could wedge it under part of the cabinet. Maybe he could shift his weight enough to free his leg. Or maybe he could push the drawer section aside just enough to gain movement. He stretched his arm outward, reaching fingers toward the broomstick. Too far. He shifted his torso, gritting his teeth as pain shot up his leg. The broom's handle slid another inch as Duke nudged it unconsciously, while turning to face the shifting shadows outside. Just a little more. Walter reached again, fingers brushing the wood. Outside, the puma growled, the sound deeper this time, closer. Duke barked wildly, his claws scraping against the tilted floor. "Come on!" Walter whispered, straining forward. His fingertips closed around the broom. The moment he pulled it toward him, the trailer slid again, this time several inches. The movement jolted both him and Duke, nearly knocking the dog off balance. Water splashed up the side of the trailer, and the entire frame tilted a little more toward the ditch. Walter's breath stopped. Another slide like that and they'd be underwater. He gripped the broom tight, turning it sideways, trying to wedge it beneath the cabinet. The angle was bad. The leverage was weak. But he pressed with all the strength he had left, arms shaking, sweat mixing with rainwater dripping from the broken ceiling. The cabinet groaned. It didn't lift, but it shifted slightly, enough to ease the pressure on his leg. Pain flared, but he could feel the possibility of movement now. He pushed again, harder, teeth clenched so tight his jaw ached. Outside, Duke barked louder, his voice breaking into frantic yelps. Walter looked up and froze. The mountain lion had climbed onto the leaning side of the trailer. Its silhouette was enormous in the darkness, muscles outlined against the storm. It lowered its head, staring through the opening with unbroken focus. Duke stood firm, but Walter saw fear in the dog's trembling legs. He pressed the broom again. The cabinet shifted one more inch. His leg slid free, not fully, but enough to pivot his hip and pull it to the side. Pain ripped through him, but he welcomed it. Pain meant movement. Movement meant survival. The lion crouched. Duke barked, backing up, positioning himself between Walter and the opening. Walter braced himself, breath shaking. The storm, the ditch, the lion, the trapped leg, all of it converged into one truth. He wasn't getting out unless he fought for every second. And the night was far from over. In moments like these, people remember the scariest situation they ever faced. Tell me in the comments, have you ever felt truly trapped or helpless in a storm? The mountain lion didn't leap. It didn't need to. Predators like that didn't rush unless they were desperate or inexperienced, and this one was neither. Walter could see it in the way the animal balanced itself on the slanted outer wall of the trailer. Calm, centered, patient. It blinked slowly, water dripping from its whiskers as though the storm meant nothing to it. Duke, soaked and trembling, barked furiously at the open frame, but the puma only flicked its tail in reply. Walter's leg throbbed with every heartbeat. Though it wasn't fully free, he had gained enough movement to pull it into a safer angle, allowing circulation to return, along with a deep, aching burn. He pressed his palms against the tilted floor and lifted his torso slightly, testing how much weight he could shift to prepare for eventual escape. Pain shot through his hip and lower back, but nothing felt broken beyond repair. The adrenaline helped, even if it made his breaths come shallow and fast. Outside, the ditch roared louder. Water slammed against mud and debris, pushing harder every minute. The storm wasn't passing, it was strengthening. Each gust shook the trailer violently, and the frame groaned as if protesting the strain. Walter could feel the ground giving way beneath them, bit by bit. The structure wasn't just sliding, it was sinking. Duke barked again, this time lunging forward as if trying to chase the puma away through sheer willpower. The lion lowered its head, ears flattened, and let out a sound that cut straight through Walter's chest. A deep, resonant growl that rose above the storm itself. Duke stumbled back but didn't retreat completely. "Duke," Walter said softly, voice cracking, "come here. Stay by me." But the dog didn't move away from the threat. Loyalty had always been Duke's weakness. Even in his old age, when his joints stiffened and his energy faded quickly, he refused to leave Walter's side. Tonight, that fierce devotion put him directly in harm's path. The puma shifted in a slow, coiled motion, lowering its weight onto its front paws. It stretched its neck forward, sniffing the cold air drifting out from the trailer's interior. Rainwater dripped along its spine, outlining strong, lean muscles built for killing silently. Not theatrically, like a movie creature, but with clean precision. Walter had seen mountain lions from a distance before, back on hiking trips decades earlier. He remembered their elegance, the frightening grace in the simplicity of their movement. But seeing one here only feet away, staring into the overturned shell of his home, that was something he never imagined surviving. The trailer creaked. A piece of paneling snapped off and flew past the puma. The lion didn't flinch, but it did shift its paws, adjusting its footing on the slippery surface. The wind shoved hard against the far wall, and the entire structure leaned another inch toward the ditch. If the trailer fell completely, Walter and Duke would be swallowed by water they couldn't fight. Hypothermia, drowning, entrapment, all of it would happen fast. And the lion... Walter didn't even want to imagine how the cat might react to a sudden fall or turbulence. He had to move. He had to free his leg fully. Staying pinned was no longer an option. Walter gripped the broom tighter, pushing its bristle end under the edge of the cabinet. His arms shook with effort. Duke barked again, a burst of sound that cracked with desperation. The puma took one slow step backward, but it didn't leave. Walter shoved with everything he had left. The broom handle bent dangerously. He pressed harder, sweat mixing with rain and dust on his forehead. The cabinet shifted another half-inch, scraping loudly across the bent frame. A sudden gust slammed the trailer with the force of a sledgehammer. The structure jerked downward and sideways. Duke lost his footing and slid toward the open frame. Walter reached out with one hand and snagged the dog's collar just in time. Duke scrambled back to him, claws scraping frantically. The puma reacted instantly. Its eyes widened, tail snapping to the side. It crouched low, ready to pounce into the opening. Walter's heart pounded as if trying to break through his ribs. He raised the broom like a spear, even though he knew it was flimsy and useless against a mountain lion. But fear gave him strength. He jabbed the broom toward the opening, yelling, a raw sound that tore from his throat with more force than he expected. "Get back!" The puma recoiled, not from fear, but from surprise. It leapt off the outer wall, landing heavily on the muddy ground below, sending a spray of water in all directions. Duke barked wildly, energized by the sudden shift. Walter didn't waste the moment. He jammed the broom back under the cabinet, twisted his hips, and pulled. The pain was unbearable, a hot electric agony that traveled from his shin to his spine, but he kept moving. His leg slid free, trembling violently as circulation returned. He lay back, panting, dizzy, tears mixing with rainwater dripping from the ceiling. He was free. But that freedom came with a price. He still had to escape the trailer before it slid into the ditch, and the mountain lion was still very much here, circling, watching. Duke nudged Walter's chest, sniffing, whining softly as if asking for direction. Walter forced himself upright, gripping the wall for balance. Pain shot through his leg with every small shift, but he could move it. Barely. Enough. He looked toward the opening, where the puma had disappeared into the storm's shadows. The wind carried the sound of its paws shifting in the mud, the faint rustle of its tail brushing against wet branches. They had minutes, maybe less. Walter scanned the interior for anything he could use. A rope, a cloth, a broken board. He spotted his old winter coat caught on a hook now halfway across the sideways wall. He grabbed it and fumbled through the pockets. Nothing useful. No flashlight, no knife, no phone. He had dropped his phone during the rollover. He didn't know where it landed. And even if he found it, there was no signal in storms like this. Another gust slammed the trailer. Water surged under them. The ditch was claiming ground. He had to get out. But he couldn't go through the open frame. Not with the mountain lion there. He looked up. The rear window, now angled sideways near the top, had cracked but not shattered completely. It was small, but maybe just large enough for Duke to slip through. Maybe large enough for Walter if he angled himself right. It was the only chance they had that didn't involve stepping directly into the puma's reach. He pushed himself upward, using the wall for balance. Duke stayed at his side, watching the shadows outside with constant vigilance. Walter reached the rear window and pressed his hand against it. The glass flexed but didn't break. He needed a tool. He looked around and saw the metal toolbox that had rolled during the crash, wedged in a corner. If he could reach it, he turned back to Duke. "Come here, boy," he whispered. "Stay close. Don't let him come back." Duke pressed his body against Walter's leg, steadying him, grounding him. The dog's breath was warm against the freezing air. Walter knew the truth before he even tried to take a full step. He wasn't getting out without pushing through pain that might break him. But he also knew something else. If he didn't move now, the ditch would claim them both. He tightened his jaw, leaned on the wall, and took his first step toward the toolbox, toward escape, toward danger, toward whatever future existed on the other side of this storm. And outside, the mountain lion growled again, closer than before. The toolbox wasn't far, maybe 6 or 7 feet along the tilted floor, but to Walter Briggs, it felt like crossing a frozen lake on a fractured leg. Every inch he moved sent a sharp current of pain up through his shin, into his hip, and across his lower back. The storm outside battered the trailer with unbroken force, and each gust seemed perfectly timed to shove him off balance. Duke stayed pressed against him, matching each of Walter's shaky steps with careful, measured movements. The dog had stopped barking, but his growls rose every few seconds, a rumble that vibrated against the metal floor. The mountain lion was still nearby, watching, waiting. Walter reached for the cracked wall, using it like a railing. His fingers brushed against cold metal, and he pulled his weight upward. The floor creaked beneath him, not from age, but from the unstable ground beneath the trailer. It slid another inch toward the ditch, water splashing up the sides. The ditch sounded deeper now, angrier. The rain fed it with a steady waterfall, turning it into a flooded trench that could swallow a mobile home in minutes. He swallowed hard. They needed to be out before the ground dropped completely. The toolbox slid a little as the trailer moved, rolling a few more inches away. Walter cursed under his breath. Duke whined, nudging him as though urging him to hurry. Then he heard it, a thump from outside. Not the storm, not debris. A paw landing heavily in the mud. The mountain lion had circled around. Walter froze. Duke growled so low it was almost inaudible under the wind. Another sound followed, a slow, deliberate step. Then a second. The puma was approaching the opening again, but this time from a different angle, where Duke had less room to defend. Walter felt panic rise like cold water around his chest. He had no weapon, no exit, no ability to outrun anything. The only advantage he still had was height. The interior walls of the trailer had become ramps. If he could get to the toolbox, There would be something inside he could use to break the window or defend himself if the worst happened. He forced himself to keep moving. 1 foot, shift weight, drag the injured leg, lean on the wall. The process burned like fire along his muscles, but he didn't stop. The toolbox rolled again with the shift of the floor, and he lunged forward, catching the handle with the tips of his fingers before it slid out of reach. He grabbed it with both hands and pulled it toward him. A heavy, metallic growl erupted from outside. Walter looked up. The mountain lion's head appeared at the broken doorframe, illuminated by a flicker of lightning behind it. Rain glistened on its fur. Its eyes locked onto Walter immediately. Not Duke, not the interior movement, but Walter himself, trapped, injured, and unable to flee. Duke lunged forward before Walter could stop him. The dog's bark exploded in the confined space, echoing off the tilted walls. The puma recoiled, slamming its paws into the mud as it backed away. For a moment, it disappeared into the shadows again, but Walter knew it hadn't retreated far. The lion was too smart, too experienced. It wouldn't abandon such a vulnerable target easily. "Good boy. Good boy," Walter whispered, though his voice trembled with fear more than comfort. He opened the toolbox as quickly as his shaking hands allowed. Inside he found a hammer, a wrench, a screwdriver, a roll of duct tape, a small crowbar, and, thank God, a flashlight. He grabbed the hammer and flashlight. The light flickered weakly before steadying into a narrow beam. The battery was nearly dead, but even that small glow gave him a surge of hope. He limped back toward the rear window, Duke staying glued to his side. The window pane had cracked, but not shattered fully. If he could break it cleanly, they might crawl out onto the higher side of the structure, away from the ditch, away from the lion. He raised the hammer and hesitated. A loud sound might draw the puma's attention back immediately. Then again, the puma was already close enough to hear his breathing. He struck. The first hit bounced off the glass with a dull thud, sending pain up his arm. The second hit fractured the pane into a web of cracks. The third shattered it, sending shards raining onto the muddy ground below. The wind shoved its way through the new opening, spraying rain into his face. But the escape route was real now, a narrow gap, angled and awkward, but open. He motioned for Duke. "Go. Up. Come on, boy." Duke hesitated, whining, but then he stepped onto the incline and squeezed his body through the broken frame. His hind legs caught briefly, scraping against the metal, but he pushed through and dropped onto the ground outside. Walter heard his paws hit mud, followed by a quick shake to rid the rain. Walter forced his body upward, gripping the edges of the frame. His legs screamed in protest, but he ignored the pain. He had to get outside before the trailer moved again. He pulled his torso through the opening. Cold rain hit his back. His arms trembled violently from effort. Duke barked from below, as if urging him on. Halfway through, the trailer slid again, abruptly, violently. Walter slipped, scraping his ribs against the metal frame. Mud splashed his face. His feet dangled over the ditch, and terror surged through him as the flooded trench stretched beneath him like a swallowing mouth. He clung to the frame with both hands, teeth clenched, body shaking. "Hold on," he gasped to himself, though no one could hear. Duke barked frantically, circling below, drenched fur plastered to his body. Walter tried to pull again. His arms burned. His injured leg hung uselessly. His strength wavered. And then the growl. Close. Too close. Walter turned his head. The mountain lion was approaching from the side, stepping onto the same slanted wall the trailer leaned against. It had moved silently through the dark, waiting for the moment when Walter was most exposed. Its muscles rippled under rain-soaked fur. Its whiskers twitched. Its eyes locked on Walter, hanging helplessly in the frame. Duke barked again, a frantic, breaking sound, and charged toward the puma with everything he had left. The lion swiped, claws scraping the trailer's outer shell, but Duke darted back at the last possible second. Walter pulled himself up again, fighting with every breath. Inch by inch his elbows found leverage. He dragged his chest over the frame, then his waist. Pain exploded through him, but he didn't stop. He rolled onto the exterior wall of the trailer, collapsing into the mud beside Duke. Rain pounded his face. The wind howled. The ditch surged below, waiting. The puma crouched only feet away. Walter's hammer was still in his hand. He gripped it tighter. The night was not done testing him. Rain hammered Walter's face, each drop sharp as needles in the freezing air. The overturned trailer loomed beside him, balanced on the lip of the ditch like a dying beast waiting to collapse. The ground beneath his palms trembled with every gust of wind. Somewhere inside the metal shell, dishes clattered and loose beams groaned. The storm would not spare anything tonight. Not wood, not steel, not flesh. Duke stood in front of him, soaking wet, shoulders low, teeth exposed in a trembling snarl. The mountain lion paced only a few yards away, its movement smooth and deliberate despite the chaos around them. Water rolled off its fur, its tail swayed, its muscles rippled under the dim flashes of lightning that lit the sky. The animal wasn't afraid of the storm, or of Duke, or even of Walter. It was studying them, measuring distance, waiting for an opening. Walter clutched the hammer in his right hand. His leg throbbed relentlessly, each second sending a surge of burning pain through his shin and up into his hip. He could barely stand. His body shook from cold and exhaustion, but he planted his feet in the mud, raising the hammer weakly, knowing full well it wouldn't stop a creature that had survived countless storms before this one. The puma stepped closer. Duke barked in a frenzy, jumping forward to intercept. The lion retreated a single step, watching the old dog with an unreadable calm. It wasn't intimidated, but neither was it reckless. The ditch behind Walter growled with dark water, swirling and pulling at roots and debris. The trailer slid again, just an inch, but enough to send a shiver of terror through him. If it toppled fully into the ditch, the water would swallow the entire structure. And if Walter lost his footing, the current would drag him under before he could fight back. He had two threats. He had one injured leg, and he had a dog too old to keep this up for long. "Come on, boy," Walter whispered through chattering teeth, grabbing Duke's collar gently. "Stay with me, don't go near it again." But Duke's loyalty wouldn't bend. He stayed planted between Walter and the mountain lion, shaking from cold but refusing to step back. The puma lowered its head. Rainwater dripped from its whiskers. Its shoulders tightened. It was preparing to charge. Walter's heart pounded in his throat. He lifted the hammer higher, though his grip had grown weak and numb. Lightning cracked the sky, illuminating the scene with a cold white flash. For a moment everything froze. The cat, the dog, the trembling old man, all suspended in the violent glow. Then movement broke the stillness. Not the puma, not Duke, the ground. A section of earth beneath the trailer gave way, collapsing with a deep sucking sound as mud slid toward the ditch in a rushing cascade. The trailer shifted, groaning, and tilted dangerously toward Walter. "No, no, no!" he gasped, stumbling backward as mud splashed over his boots. Duke leapt toward him, barking wildly. The puma jumped aside, muscles rippling as it landed gracefully out of the slide zone. But Walter wasn't that lucky. His injured leg buckled, and he dropped to one knee as the earth shifted beneath him. The trailer lurched downward. A wall of cold water splashed upward as the lower half dipped into the ditch. Walter rolled onto his side instinctively. The movement sent a jolt of agony through his leg, but adrenaline numbed the worst of it. He clawed at the mud, dragging himself away from the collapsing edge. Duke barked and shoved his head under Walter's shoulder, trying to help him stand. "Good boy. Good boy," Walter groaned, leaning heavily on the dog. The puma watched from its new vantage point, not retreating, not advancing, just observing with unsettling patience. The storm flattened its ears, but didn't break its focus. If Walter fell, if Duke tired, if either exposed a weakness, the cat would take advantage. Walter needed higher ground. He needed distance. He needed anything that wasn't slick mud and rising water. He scanned the area with frantic eyes. Behind them, about 20 feet uphill, stood an old stump from a cottonwood tree that had been cut down years ago. Beside it lay a cluster of boulders half buried in the slope. They weren't perfect, but they offered elevation, a place where he could position himself with Duke and reduce the puma's approach options. He leaned on Duke and began the slow climb toward the stump. Each step was a battle. The mud sucked at his boots. His leg screamed. Wind pushed him sideways. But Duke stayed close, guiding him, nudging his hip when he slipped, barking at the puma when it drifted too near. Halfway up the slope, Walter slipped again. His knee hit the mud so hard he saw stars. Duke barked, racing in front of him and circling back as if urging him to stand. "Hurry! Walter! Move!" he whispered to himself, half delirious, half begging his own limbs to cooperate. The puma began moving again, slowly, carefully, paws sinking into mud with silent precision. Walter forced himself upright. Using the stump as leverage, he collapsed against it, chest heaving, lungs burning with cold air. Duke pressed himself against Walter's leg, panting hard, exhausted. Lightning flashed again, and the puma's silhouette appeared at the base of the slope. Walter tightened his grip on the hammer. He was shaking so badly he could barely hold it straight. The puma approached, muscles rippling, eyes fixed on Walter. It began climbing the slope, moving with effortless grace despite the mud. Duke launched forward again, barking with all the strength he had left. The lion hesitated, assessing the old dog's courage. Walter saw his opening, a single moment in which the lion's focus flickered. He raised the flashlight and pointed it directly at the lion's face. With his thumb, he flicked the weak beam on. The light was dim, trembling with the last of its battery, but in the darkness of the storm, it pierced through enough to make the puma recoil. Its pupils shrank. Its body tensed. It stepped back. "Go, get out of here," Walter shouted, voice breaking. He advanced one shaky step, swinging the hammer downward to make noise. Duke barked beside him, adding strength to the illusion of power. The puma's ears flattened. It backed down another step. Walter advanced again. His flashlight flickered once, then steadied just long enough to shine into the cat's eyes. The puma growled, a warning, then turned suddenly, leaping away from the light and disappearing into the trees. Walter remained standing only because Duke pressed against his leg to keep him up. He let out a breath that felt like it carried the weight of his entire body. The worst of the moment had passed, but the storm hadn't, and his home, what remained of it, was sliding deeper into the ditch. He leaned on Duke and looked toward the dark road at the edge of his property. They weren't safe. Not yet. But they were still alive. And that meant the story wasn't over. By the time the wind eased enough for rescue crews to reach the outskirts of Colorado Springs, Walter Briggs was barely conscious. He and Duke had managed to climb far enough up the slope to escape the collapsing trailer, but the cold had drained the last of his strength. When the headlights finally cut through the storm and voices called his name, he could only lift a shaking hand toward the light. They found him leaning against the old stump. Duke pressed tightly to his side, as if refusing to let go until help arrived. The rescuers wrapped them both in blankets, carried Walter to the truck, and lifted Duke in right after him. The dog didn't stop watching Walter until the ambulance doors closed. Walter survived with a fractured leg, deep bruising, and a long recovery ahead of him. But every medic who spoke to him said the same thing. If he hadn't freed himself when he did, if he hadn't climbed away from the ditch, he and Duke would never have been found in time. As the storm faded and dawn broke over the soaked plains, Walter looked at Duke and whispered, "We made it, buddy. Somehow we made it." Moments like these remind us that survival isn't just strength. Sometimes it's love, instinct, or sheer will. Tell me in the comments, what's one difficult moment in your life that you pushed through when it felt impossible?